He thought he was removing a cleaner from his building, but in less than 10 minutes, he would realize he had just tried to throw out the one person who owned every square foot beneath his polished floors. The morning light spilled across the marble lobby of Lexington Tower, casting long reflections that shimmered like glass under every hurried step, and down near the service corridor, where the air smelled faintly of detergent and steel, Evelyn Carter moved quietly with a mop cart that rattled just enough to be noticed, but never enough to matter. At 38, she wore her uniform like she wore everything else in life. Simple, unremarkable, deliberately invisible. And as she pushed the cart forward, her eyes lifted briefly, scanning the ceiling cameras, the reception desk, the elevators, not with curiosity, but with quiet calculation. Most people never noticed how observant she was, and that was exactly how she preferred it. Upstairs, executives adjusted ties worth more than her entire outfit. Investors checked watches that gleamed under recessed lighting, and somewhere between the lobby and the upper floors, Mark Reynolds stepped out of a private elevator, already irritated before his day had properly begun. As building manager, he carried authority in his posture, his tailored suit sharp against the muted tones of the space, and his patience thin for anything that disrupted the image of perfection he worked hard to maintain. He glanced across the lobby, scanning for problems, and then his eyes landed on Evelyn. She didn't look like she belonged. Not here, not in a building that hosted law firms, financial institutions, and private equity giants. And when her cartwheels rolled just a little too close to the polished reception desk, Mark's jaw tightened. He slowed his stride, watching her with growing annoyance as she paused near one of the pillars, glancing up again at the surveillance dome above, as if checking something that didn't fit his idea of her role. Around them, the lobby hummed with low conversation, the echo of dress shoes, the quiet authority of wealth moving through space. But Mark saw only disruption. To him, order was everything, and anything, or anyone, that threatened that order needed to be corrected immediately. He adjusted his cuff, took a breath, and started toward her, already forming the words in his mind, already deciding how this interaction would end, unaware that every step he took was bringing him closer to a mistake he wouldn't be able to undo. Evelyn, meanwhile, didn't move, didn't rush, didn't lower her gaze like most would under that kind of attention. Instead, she stood there, one hand resting lightly on the handle of the cart, her expression calm, her presence steady in a way that didn't match the role she appeared to play. And for just a fraction of a second, so brief it almost didn't exist, there was something in her eyes that suggested she wasn't here by accident. Mark didn't notice it. Not yet, because in his world, people like her were background noise, easily dismissed, easily removed. And as he approached, the space between authority and assumption narrowed into something sharp, something irreversible, something that would soon bring the entire room to a silence no one saw coming. Mark Reynolds stopped just a few feet from her, the faint echo of his shoes against the marble floor drawing a subtle line of attention from those nearby. And when he spoke, his voice carried the practiced authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Excuse me," he said sharply, his eyes flicking to the cart and then back to her face. "This area is restricted. You are not supposed to be here right now." And the words were not loud, but they were deliberate, designed to be heard by more than just the person standing in front of him. Evelyn lifted her gaze slowly, meeting his eyes without hesitation, her expression calm, almost neutral, as if she had heard this tone before and learned long ago not to react to it. "I am just finishing a routine check," she replied, her voice soft but steady, the kind of voice that did not challenge, yet did not submit either. And for a brief second, Mark frowned, not because of what she said, but because of how she said it. It was not the answer he expected from someone in her position, and something about it unsettled him in a way he could not quite define. But irritation quickly replaced that feeling. "Routine check," he repeated, a hint of disbelief creeping into his tone. "That is not your responsibility, and certainly not on this floor." His hand gestured subtly toward the surrounding space, the polished reception desk, the private elevators, the quiet presence of high-profile tenants who were beginning to notice the exchange. "This is a premium access level," he added, his voice tightening, "and I do not recall approving any cleaning staff for inspection duties here this morning." A receptionist glanced up from her screen, her fingers pausing mid-keystroke, while a man in a navy suit slowed his pace just enough to listen without appearing obvious. The kind of silent audience that always gathered when authority was being asserted. Evelyn did not move, her hand still resting lightly on the cart, her posture unchanged. "I understand," she said calmly. "But there are a few things that needed to be verified personally." And again, the phrasing caught him off guard. Verified. Personally. Those were not words he associated with someone pushing a mop cart through service corridors. And yet here she was, using them as if they belonged to her. Mark's expression hardened, his patience wearing thinner by the second. "No, you do not understand," he replied, this time his voice rising just enough to carry across the lobby, drawing more attention. "What needs to be verified here is who authorized you to step outside your assigned duties. Because from where I am standing, you are out of place and out of line, and I am not going to have this building's standards compromised because someone decided to ignore protocol." His words hung in the air, sharper now, edged with the kind of public correction meant to establish control. And a faint murmur passed through the small cluster of onlookers. Evelyn's eyes did not waver, but there was a subtle shift in her expression, not anger, not embarrassment, but something quieter, something more deliberate, as if she were deciding how much longer to allow this moment to unfold. "I assure you," she said, her tone still even, "I am exactly where I need to be." And that was when the atmosphere changed, not dramatically, not all at once, but enough that the silence around them deepened. Because confidence like that, in a place like this, from someone like her, did not belong, and Mark felt it, even if he refused to acknowledge it. And instead of stepping back, he leaned further into his authority, his next decision already forming, one that would push this encounter beyond correction and into something far more final, something he believed would restore order, but would soon do the opposite. Mark Reynolds exhaled slowly, the kind of measured breath that came just before a decision was made. And when he spoke again, his voice carried a sharper edge, one that left little room for interpretation. "I am not going to repeat myself," he said, his gaze fixed firmly on Evelyn. "You are not authorized to be here. And at this point, you are disrupting operations in a restricted area." His hand moved toward his phone with deliberate calm, a gesture that signaled escalation without needing to announce it. And for a brief moment, the lobby seemed to lean into the tension, conversations softening, footsteps slowing, attention quietly shifting toward the unfolding scene. Evelyn remained still, her posture unchanged, her expression composed in a way that did not match the growing weight of the situation, and that contrast, her stillness against his rising authority, only seemed to irritate him further, because in his experience, people in her position usually apologized, stepped back, lowered their gaze, but she did none of those things. Instead, she simply watched him, as if allowing him to continue, as if this moment belonged to him for now. Mark tapped the screen of his phone and brought it to his ear, his tone turning crisp and professional. "Security, this is Reynolds in the main lobby. I need assistance immediately. There is an unauthorized staff member in a restricted area refusing to comply with instructions." A pause followed as he listened, then added, "Yes, by the reception desk. Please handle it quickly. We cannot have disruptions at this level." He ended the call and slipped the phone back into his pocket, his expression settling into something closer to satisfaction, as if the situation had now been properly managed. A quiet ripple moved through the onlookers, not loud enough to be called a reaction, but noticeable in the way people adjusted their stance, the way eyes lingered longer than before, the way the air itself seemed to hold a little tighter. Evelyn's gaze shifted briefly toward the entrance, not in concern, but in quiet acknowledgement, as if she already knew what was coming, and then returned to Mark, her voice calm when she spoke again. "There is no need to escalate this," she said, her tone carrying a subtle firmness now, not defensive, not confrontational, but grounded. "I am not interfering with anything here, and this will be resolved shortly." The words were simple, but they landed differently this time, because they did not sound like reassurance, they sounded like certainty. Mark let out a short breath that almost resembled a laugh, though there was no humor in it. "Resolved?" he repeated, shaking his head slightly. "No. What is going to happen is very clear. You are going to leave this floor, and if you do not, you will be escorted out of the building entirely." And I suggest you cooperate before this becomes more embarrassing than it already is." The last sentence was delivered just loudly enough to ensure it reached the ears of those nearby. A calculated move, the kind that reinforced authority by making an example. A man standing near the elevators glanced away, uncomfortable, while the receptionist lowered her eyes back to her screen, though her typing did not resume. Evelyn's fingers adjusted slightly on the handle of the card. A small, almost imperceptible movement. And for the first time, there was a shift in her presence, not visible in posture, not obvious in expression, but something quieter, something internal, as if a decision had been made. From the far end of the lobby, the faint sound of approaching footsteps began to echo, measured, purposeful, and the moment stretched, suspended between what Mark believed was control and what was about to unravel it completely, though he could not see it yet. And the space between certainty and consequence narrowed with every second that passed. The sound of approaching footsteps grew clearer, firm, and synchronized, cutting through the polished calm of the lobby as two security officers stepped into view, their presence immediately shifting the atmosphere from tension to expectation. And Mark Reynolds straightened slightly, his posture settling into quiet confidence as he gestured subtly in Evelyn's direction. "There she is," he said, his voice low but precise. "This individual is not authorized to be on this floor. Please escort her out." The words were clean, practiced, the kind that reduced a person to a problem to be removed. And for a brief moment, everything seemed to align exactly as he intended. The officers nodded, moving forward with professional neutrality, their expressions unreadable as they approached Evelyn, who had not moved, had not stepped back, had not even tightened her grip on the cart. Instead, she watched them with the same steady calm, as if this moment was unfolding exactly on schedule. "Ma'am," one of the officers began, his tone respectful but firm, "we're going to need you to come with us." And though the words were polite, the implication was clear. The situation had reached its conclusion, at least from their perspective. Around them, the quiet audience had grown, not in number, but in attention. Conversations had fully faded now, replaced by the kind of silence that settles when something feels just slightly off, just slightly different from the ordinary flow of the day. Evelyn tilted her head just enough to acknowledge the officer, her voice gentle when she replied. "I understand your position," she said, "and I appreciate your professionalism, but I am not leaving." The simplicity of the statement hung in the air longer than expected, not because it was loud, but because it carried no hesitation, no apology, no fear. And that was when one of the officers hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, his eyes flicking briefly toward Mark, then back to her, as if recalibrating something he could not yet define. Mark's expression hardened instantly. "That is not a request," he said, stepping forward half a pace, his voice sharper now. "This is a directive, and you are refusing to comply with building management, which gives us every right to remove you from the premises." His words echoed slightly against the marble, amplified by the stillness of the room, and for the first time, there was a subtle shift in the way people were watching, less curiosity now, more tension, as if something beneath the surface had begun to crack. Evelyn slowly removed one hand from the cart, her fingers brushing lightly against the fabric of her glove before she slid it off with deliberate ease, the motion unhurried, almost ceremonial. And when she looked back at Mark, her eyes were no longer just calm, they were resolved. "There is something you should know before you continue," she said quietly, her voice no louder than before, yet it carried farther, clearer, as if the room itself had leaned in to listen, "because what happens next will not be easy to reverse." The words were not a threat, not even a warning in the traditional sense, but they landed with a weight that did not belong to someone in her position. Mark let out a short, dismissive breath, his patience gone entirely. "I think we are past that point," he replied, gesturing again toward the officers. "Please proceed." And for a heartbeat, everything paused, the officers shifting slightly, the air tightening, the moment balanced on the edge of action. And then Evelyn reached calmly into her pocket, her movements smooth, controlled, as she pulled out her phone, her gaze never leaving Mark as she unlocked the screen, dialed a number, and lifted it to her ear, her voice steady as she spoke. "Yes," she said simply, "send them down, all of them." The call ended as quietly as it began, and for a second, Nothing happened. No immediate change. No visible reaction. Just the lingering echo of her words settling into the silence. And then, from somewhere above, far beyond the lobby ceiling, the faint hum of elevators began to descend in unison, a detail so subtle it might have gone unnoticed, if not for the way Evelyn stood perfectly still, as if she had just pressed a button that would change everything. The low hum of descending elevators deepened, no longer subtle now, but unmistakable, a synchronized motion from multiple shafts that caused a few heads in the lobby to tilt upward in quiet confusion. And for the first time since the confrontation began, Mark Reynolds hesitated, not visibly enough to draw attention, but internally, a flicker of uncertainty pressed against his certainty. Because elevators did not move like that without reason, not all at once, not to the same floor. The security officers exchanged a brief glance, their stance loosening just slightly, not stepping back, but no longer advancing, as if something in the environment had shifted beyond their control. Evelyn remained exactly where she was, her phone now lowered at her side, her posture relaxed, almost patient, as though she had simply set something in motion and was now waiting for it to arrive. A soft chime echoed through the lobby as the first elevator reached the ground floor, its doors sliding open with a precision that matched the building's polished reputation, and from inside stepped a man in a charcoal suit, followed by a woman carrying a leather portfolio, both moving with quiet urgency, their eyes scanning the lobby before locking onto Evelyn. Another chime followed, then another, as more elevators opened in sequence, each releasing individuals who did not belong to the usual rhythm of the morning: executives, legal advisors, operations directors, people whose presence alone shifted the balance of any room they entered. Conversations did not just stop now, they disappeared entirely, replaced by a silence that felt deliberate, almost respectful, as if the building itself recognized something unfolding. Mark straightened, his confusion sharpening into irritation again as he watched the group converge. "Excuse me," he began, stepping forward, his voice regaining its authoritative edge. "This area is currently handling a situation. You will need to." He stopped mid-sentence, the words catching somewhere between intention and realization, because the man in the charcoal suit did not look at him, did not acknowledge him, did not even slow his pace. Instead, he walked directly past him and toward Evelyn, his expression shifting from focused to composed in a single step. "Miss Carter," the man said clearly, his voice carrying across the lobby with quiet respect, "we received your call." And in that instant, something fractured in the air, not loudly, not dramatically, but unmistakably, like a shift in gravity that no one could ignore. Mark's mouth parted slightly, his eyes moving from the man to Evelyn and back again, trying to reconcile the disconnect between what he had assumed and what was now standing in front of him. The woman with the portfolio stepped forward next, her tone professional but deferential. "The board is assembled and ready," she said, glancing briefly around the lobby before returning her focus to Evelyn. "We can proceed whenever you are prepared." A murmur, faint but real, rippled through the onlookers. Not words, not questions, just the sound of understanding beginning to form, incomplete but undeniable. Evelyn gave a small nod, acknowledging them without ceremony. "Thank you for coming down so quickly," she replied, her voice unchanged, still calm, still measured, as if nothing about this moment required adjustment. And that, more than anything, unsettled Mark. Because everything about this moment required adjustment, everything except her. He took a step forward, his voice lower now, edged with something that had not been there before: confusion. "I am sorry," he said, struggling to maintain composure, "but what exactly is going on here?" And the question, though directed at the group, hung between him and Evelyn, because deep down, he already knew the answer was about to change everything he thought he understood, and the room, once filled with quiet judgment, now held its breath for the truth to finally surface. Mark Reynolds felt the shift before he fully understood it, the kind of shift that did not announce itself but settled into the room like a weight pressing down on every assumption he had made. And as he stood there, trying to reconcile the presence of executives who answered to no one in this building except the highest authority, his gaze returned slowly to Evelyn Carter, who had not raised her voice, had not changed her posture, had not done anything except stand still while the entire dynamic around her transformed. The man in the charcoal suit turned slightly, now acknowledging Mark with a measured look, the kind reserved for interruptions rather than equals, and spoke with controlled clarity. "This situation has already been escalated appropriately," he said, his tone leaving no room for debate, "and it will be handled from here. Thank you." The dismissal was polite, but unmistakable, and for the first time that morning, Mark found himself without a response that fit the moment. "I am the building manager," he said, though his voice lacked the same certainty it carried before, "and I need to understand why I was not informed of any." He stopped again, not because he chose to, but because Evelyn had finally moved, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with a quiet authority that drew every eye in the room without effort. She stepped forward just enough to close the distance between them, her presence no longer blending into the background, but defining it, and when she spoke, her voice remained calm, but there was something different beneath it now, something unmistakable, something that did not ask to be heard, but simply was. "You were not informed," she said evenly, "because the transition was finalized less than 12 hours ago, and the notification protocol begins at the executive level, not management." The words landed with precision, each one dismantling the structure Mark had relied on to define his authority. The woman with the portfolio opened it smoothly, retrieving a set of documents and extending them toward Evelyn, who accepted them with a brief nod before turning them slightly so Mark could see. Not close enough to read every line, but enough to recognize the letterhead, the signatures, the official seals that carried more weight than any verbal explanation. "The acquisition of Lexington Tower," Evelyn continued, her eyes steady on his, "was completed this morning at 7:30 Eastern Time, and as of that moment, all operational authority, including management oversight, reports directly to me." The silence that followed was not empty, it was absolute, the kind that erased every previous sound in the room and replaced it with a single, undeniable truth. Mark's expression shifted in stages, confusion giving way to realization, realization to disbelief, and disbelief to something quieter, something heavier, because the implications unfolded faster than he could process them. Every word he had spoken, every command he had issued, every assumption he had made now reframed in a context he could not escape. The security officers stepped back without being told, their posture adjusting instinctively, no longer responding to him, but to the shift in authority that had just been made unmistakably clear. Evelyn lowered the documents, handing them back without ceremony, and in that moment, the entire lobby seemed to hold its breath, not out of tension anymore, but out of recognition, because what had just been revealed was not simply a reversal, it was a complete redefinition of power, and standing at the center of it was the woman he had tried to remove, the one person in the building he had understood the least. Mark Reynolds did not move, not at first, as if the weight of what he had just heard had anchored him in place, his mind racing through every moment of the last 10 minutes, replaying each word he had spoken with a clarity that now felt unforgiving. And for the first time since stepping into the lobby, the authority he carried so easily began to slip, not outwardly in a dramatic collapse, but inwardly, where confidence turned into calculation and calculation into quiet panic. His eyes flicked briefly toward the security officers, then to the executives standing behind Evelyn, but none of them were looking to him anymore. None of them were waiting for his direction, and that absence, that sudden loss of recognition, was louder than anything that had been said. "I was not aware of any ownership transition," he said finally, his voice lower now, more controlled, as if choosing his words carefully might restore some balance to the situation. And if there had been proper communication, this entire misunderstanding could have been avoided. The statement was measured, almost diplomatic, but beneath it lingered the unmistakable attempt to reposition himself, to shift the narrative away from what had just happened and toward what could still be managed. Evelyn listened without interruption, her expression unchanged, her posture steady, and when he finished, there was a brief pause, not long, but deliberate, the kind that allowed his words to settle before she responded. "Communication protocols are structured for efficiency," she said calmly, not defensively, not dismissively, simply stating a fact, and they prioritize executive continuity during transitional periods. Her gaze held his, not confrontational, but unyielding, which means operational adjustments occur before notifications reach every level, including management. The explanation was clear, but it did not offer him the ground he was searching for. It did not soften what had already taken place. Mark nodded once, slowly, as if acknowledging the logic, though his expression tightened slightly. Then perhaps we can move forward constructively, he said, his tone shifting again, this time toward professionalism. If there are new directives or expectations under your leadership, I would be more than willing to ensure they are implemented immediately. The words were careful now, deliberate in their neutrality, an attempt to rebuild alignment, to demonstrate adaptability, to show that he could still be part of whatever came next. Around them, the silence remained, but it had changed. No longer tense, no longer uncertain, but observant, as if everyone present understood that the outcome of this moment would define more than just a misunderstanding. It would define what kind of leadership would follow. Evelyn took a small step closer, closing the space between them just enough that her voice no longer needed to carry. It simply needed to be heard. I appreciate your willingness to adapt, she said, her tone even, but there was a subtle shift beneath it, something firmer, something more precise. But adaptation is most meaningful when it is rooted in awareness, not reaction, and the words, though calmly delivered, landed with unmistakable weight. Mark's jaw tightened slightly, not in resistance, but in recognition, because he understood exactly what she meant, even if he did not want to fully admit it. And for a brief moment, neither of them spoke, the room holding that silence like a frame around the lesson unfolding in real time. Behind Evelyn, the executives remained still, attentive but unobtrusive, their presence reinforcing what had already been established without needing to say a word. And in that moment, the power dynamic was no longer shifting. It had settled completely, leaving only one question unanswered, not about authority, but about consequence, and whether what had just happened would be addressed as a mistake or remembered as something far more defining. The silence stretched just long enough to make every second feel intentional, and in that stillness, Evelyn Carter did not rush, did not fill the space with unnecessary words, because she understood something that most people in that lobby were only beginning to realize, that authority did not need to be loud to be absolute. She glanced briefly toward the reception desk, then to the security officers who had already stepped back, their posture now aligned with her presence rather than Mark's. And then her attention returned to him, steady and composed. There is a difference, she said calmly, between maintaining standards and assuming them, and the words settled into the room with quiet precision, not sharp, not aggressive, but undeniable. Mark inhaled slowly, his shoulders tightening for just a moment before he released the tension, attempting to hold onto the professional composure that had defined him for years. I acted in accordance with building protocol, he replied, his tone measured, though not as firm as before. Anyone in my position would have done the same. And while the statement sounded reasonable, it carried the weight of justification more than certainty. Evelyn nodded once, acknowledging the logic without conceding to it. Protocol exists to guide decisions, she said, but it does not replace judgment, and judgment is revealed in how we treat people when we believe they have no authority. The lobby seemed to absorb that sentence, the kind of quiet that followed not from confusion, but from recognition, because everyone present understood exactly what she meant, even if no one spoke. The man in the charcoal suit shifted slightly, his voice entering the moment with respectful clarity. Miss Carter, the board is prepared to proceed with the initial review. We can relocate to the conference level whenever you are ready. Evelyn gave a small nod, but did not move immediately. Instead, she kept her attention on Mark, as if this moment, this exact point in time, mattered more than anything waiting upstairs. Before we proceed, she said, her voice softer now, but no less firm, I believe clarity is important, especially at the beginning of any transition. And she paused just long enough for the words to carry, not rushed, not delayed, simply precise, effective immediately. She continued, all management roles will be reviewed, not based on tenure, but on decision-making under pressure. The sentence landed cleanly, without emphasis, without dramatics, yet its meaning expanded instantly across the room. Mark felt it before he responded. the implication settling into his chest with a weight that could not be ignored. "I understand," he said quietly, though his voice betrayed the shift within him, no longer leading, no longer directing, but acknowledging. Evelyn studied him for a moment, not with judgment, not with anger, but with a clarity that saw beyond the situation itself. Then she gave a slight nod, as if confirming something only she could define. "Good," she said simply, and turned, her movement smooth, unhurried, as she began to walk toward the elevators, the executives falling into step behind her without instruction. The doors opened almost immediately, as if anticipating her arrival, and one by one, they entered, the space parting for her without question, without hesitation. Mark remained where he stood, the lobby no longer watching out of curiosity, but out of quiet understanding, because what had just happened was not just a reversal of power, it was a reflection of something deeper, something that could not be corrected with a single conversation. As the elevator doors closed, the final image lingered, not of authority asserted, but of authority revealed. And in the reflection of the polished steel, for the first time that morning, Mark saw himself not as the one in control, but as the one who had been seen clearly all along. The elevator doors closed with a soft, final precision, sealing the moment upstairs while leaving its echo behind in the lobby. And for several seconds, no one moved, no one spoke, as if the entire space needed time to recalibrate itself after what had just unfolded. The polished floors still reflected the same light. The reception desk still stood in perfect order, but something intangible had shifted, something that could not be reset with routine or protocol. Mark Reynolds remained where he was, his posture no longer defined by authority but by stillness, his eyes fixed on the now empty elevator doors as the reality of the past few minutes settled into something heavier than embarrassment, something closer to realization. Around him, the quiet audience slowly began to disperse, not abruptly, but with the subtle awareness that they had witnessed something more than a workplace misunderstanding. They had seen a line drawn and revealed, a line between assumption and truth, between position and character. The security officers stepped back toward their original posts, their movements respectful, almost subdued, no longer part of an action, but part of a conclusion. The receptionist resumed typing, though her fingers moved more carefully now, as if the rhythm of the building had changed in a way that required attention. Mark finally exhaled, a slow, measured breath that carried with it the weight of recognition, and as he turned slightly, his reflection caught in the polished surface of a nearby column. He saw not the confident manager who had entered the lobby earlier, but someone who had been confronted with something far less comfortable. Himself. The words replayed in his mind, not hers alone, but his own, each sentence stripped of its original certainty and placed against a new context that did not excuse, did not soften, did not reinterpret. He understood now that nothing about what had happened would be erased by time or explained away by policy, because the moment had already done its work. It had revealed something that could not be unseen. Upstairs, beyond the reach of the lobby's quiet tension, decisions were already being discussed, evaluations already forming, not out of reaction, but out of clarity. And while Mark could not hear those conversations, he did not need to, because he already knew what they would be built upon. He adjusted his sleeve slightly, a habitual motion that no longer carried the same confidence, and for a moment, he considered what came next, not in terms of control or correction, but in terms of consequence and change. The building continued around him, elevators moving, doors opening, voices returning, but beneath it all, something remained, a stillness that lingered just long enough to mark the moment as something more than ordinary. And as Mark stood there, no longer at the center of attention, but no longer unaware, there was a quiet understanding that settled in, not forced, not spoken, but undeniable, that respect is not enforced by position. It is revealed in the moments when no one believes you have any power at all. And in that lobby, on that morning, the truth had not been announced. It had simply been shown, and it would be remembered long after the floors were cleaned and the routine returned to normal.